So today I'm going to look at an interesting part of Australian history that most people gloss over. I'm going to look at the function of the public sector in Australian history. Now, and I'm talking about colonial history, I'm not talking about pre-colonial period, that's a different story. So, when the first colonisers arrived at Port Jackson on the 26th of January 1788, it's important to remember it was a penal colony. There were convicts, there were soldiers, there were bureaucrats, and every single person was property of the Crown. It was a true public sector. There was no legal private enterprise in the first 10 to 15 years of colonisation, because the only people that are allowed in were people who are either convicts or people who work for the government. So in many regards, if you want to look at this, you know, a little bit of a smirk, a bit of a laugh, that's how it started off, as a public sector enterprise. Now, what happened by the 1820s and 1830s is that the squatters had become exceptionally powerful in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. They become powerful because of the land they were able to expropriate violently from the original inhabitants. And they started to have labour. They had two types of labour. They had free labour, which was convict labour, which was state labour, and they actually had people they employed who were normally people who'd come across to the new colony to make their fortune. Okay? So we saw the rapid growth of the private sector, but the public sector still continued to play an important role, because it was the public sector that allocated land. Because theoretically, all the land that existed on the Australian continent was Crown land. Okay? So that's just the beginning. Now, with the rise of immigration, and by the 1850s, the rapid decline of convict labour as the transportation system began to cease in various parts of the Australian continent, what we saw was a rapid growth of a traditional working class. But the land was locked in the hands of the squatters. For example, within 15 years, the colonisation process beginning in what we call Victoria today, 700 squatters owned the land. Some under Crown assent, some didn't have Crown assent, they just took it. Right? So you've got a rapid rise in the private sector. Now, as the convict system drew to a close, the country was short of labour, so immigration played a more important role in the expansion of colonial Australia, whether it was New South Wales, South Australia, and Diemen's Land. You've got all these histories of various groups, religious refugees, political refugees, but mainly people who came here to make their fortune. That's what you came to Australia for, was to get away from the old country, get away from the so-called, well, not so-called, but from the situation you found yourself in, and maybe make some money, get some land, create a future for yourself. Obviously, this is all at the expense of what was left of the country's First Nations people. So the state then took on its traditional role. Essentially, it owned everything. It took on the traditional role of control. The state became the mechanism via which it exercised control. I mean, the state apparatus grows basically to exercise control over the population. And there were no public facilities. There were no public health facilities. There was no social security system. There was no, support from the state for the individual. The individual was basically at the mercy of their employers. And let's not forget that it was exceptionally difficult till after the Eureka Rebellion, especially in Victoria, to get any access to land, because the land was monopolised by these 700 squatters. But what happened is the power of the squatters slowly eroded because of legislation by various state governments. We saw the growth of what we describe as the traditional working class. The sort of growth of people who sold their labour in order to survive. So we saw this growth of these people. So as the population grew, the state was faced with the problem that all states are faced with. If the people you rule get a little bit shirty and start protesting and revolting, it causes a lot of issues and decreases profitability. So what happens in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, we saw a huge growth of mutual aid societies. Now, societies like the Rechabites, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, the Australian Mutual Provident Fund, right? So what happened is workers, in order to be able to survive in times of illness or crisis, put money into a central pool in a particular society whose responsibility was to provide them with support in times of need, because there was no state support. So up till the late 19th century and early 20th century, social security benefits and public facilities were basically totally non-existent. The only difference was that in the 1880s, when there was famine, after Marvellous Melbourne collapsed, that the state gave away small plots of land to people who are unemployed, to get them out of the city. And there were plots, believe it or not, in French Island. If you go to French Island, you'll see photographs of the school there in the late 19th century with hundreds of kids. They were given 25-acre sandy plots which came to nothing, right? So by the end of the 19th century, people were demanding services to be provided by the state, because they believed that the state was there not only to serve the interests of those who rule them, but it should also start looking after their interests. And the interesting thing was that in Victoria was the first entity in the world that introduced 3 compulsory non-religious education in 1876. So this saw the beginning of public education. And the big reason for public education was, as the Industrial Revolution became more sophisticated, you needed people with skills to operate the machines, to do the accounting, to do all that work. So the public education sector provided that avenue. But let's not forget that before then, and during that early sector of public education, there were the Mechanics Institutes. Now, the Mechanics Institute were an important part of the move towards providing public facilities. Some of the Mechanics Institutes were set up by the workers themselves. Most of them were set up by businesses in order to provide rudimentary skills for their workers. For example, the Melbourne Institute of Technology started off as a mechanics institute in the 1850s. And every little town you go to will have a mechanics institute. Most of them have now been privatised, but the idea was that a worker could go there and self-educate. They could read, they could learn to read, they could learn to write, because as the industrial system became more sophisticated. So people got a little bit of a taste for the idea of the state providing. And this is the concept of public assets being used for the public good. And with Federation on the 1st of January 1901, we saw the election of the first Labor government in the world in 1910. Only lasted 6 months, the Watson-led Labor government. It was the first Labor government in the world. It was elected in Australia. And they were elected on the promise that they would provide both services and security to working people. Unfortunately, the constitutional arrangements which came into place when the country was federated were totally dependent on the states agreeing to federate as one nation. And that meant that most of the power that was being exercised was exercised by the federal government, but before World War II, most of that power lay in the hands of the states. The states were responsible for taxation. The states were responsible for providing public services. The federal government had a limited role in terms of defence and in terms of foreign relations. So this is the status quo. Now, as Labor governments began to get elected at the beginning of the 20th century, we saw them create public institutions to provide for public need. And this was one of the main reasons for their electoral success. One of the first companies, publicly owned companies, which was established in Australia, was the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories in 1911, so they could produce vaccines for Australians. Because obviously it was very difficult getting vaccines here, you know. And then after that, we saw the formation of the Commonwealth Bank by the Australian federal government. Why was the Commonwealth Bank set up? Because one, privately owned banks had failed miserably during the various depressions that occurred in this country before the Federation. And secondly, and more importantly, ordinary people could not get loans from the privately owned banks. They were there basically for the business sector, provide loans for the business sector. So if you're a stonemason or a mill worker or whatever, and you wanted a roof over your head, you weren't going to get a mortgage. If you're a small business, you weren't going to get a leg up, a loan. So when the Commonwealth Bank was established by guess who? An illegal immigrant. That's right. A member of the Australian Parliament, a Canadian, not eligible under our constitutional arrangements. When the Commonwealth Bank was established, it actually opened people's eyes to what governments could do for them. And that was the key. What can a government do for me? So most Labor Party policy was based on the concept that the party was there to look after the labourer, the worker. Right? So this classical division. So we saw that between the wars, between World War I and World War I was instrumental in setting up a rudimentary social security system in this country. Because from a population of 5 million, 420,000 young Australian men volunteered to go and fight for God in the country. That's an extraordinary number. 420,000 out of a population of 5 million. That's almost 1 in 4 men volunteered. Now, of those 420,000, 62,000 died on the European killing fields, Another 60,000 died of their war wounds within a decade of returning to Australia, and many of the others were permanently scarred with psychiatric issues, which we call shell shock in those days, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this had so these men who had gone out there on the promise, they'll promise land, believe it or not, they'll promise land when they returned, and they'll promise that the state would look after them. So on the return of these servicemen and women, mainly servicemen, women were mainly in the nursing sector, what we saw is the introduction of a very generous social security system for the war wounded, and that's how it all started. And also we saw the allocation of public land, or crown land, not public, crown land, to individual soldiers in the soldier settlement schemes. As you know, most of those soldier settlement schemes failed because the blocks were too small and they were non-productive, they were given non-productive land. So you've got this large group of men who are familiar with firearms, who have fought, who expect something in return, when they return back to the country. And that started off this impetus that the state should provide, because they fought for the crown, they fought for the state. Now, in between the wars, there was little growth in social security systems. That's why the mutual aid societies, the Australian Mutual Provident Fund, Independent Order of Oddfellows, grew and grew and grew to particularly large organisations. And if you look at the history, between 1880 and about 1930, you can see the important role that these organisations held for people who work. Not for the unemployed, not for women, but only for skilled tradespeople, because they had the disposable income to insure against adversity. Now, the advent of World War II created, and it's interesting how war actually increases people's expectations. Those English amongst us who are old enough will remember people said, why was Churchill voted out by the people of Britain? It was very simple, because the people of Britain expected something in return for their sacrifices. They expected the state to look after them. It was the same in Australia. Servicemen and women came back, and if you look at the pictures when they came back, remember over 25,000 Australian men and women died in World War II, many more are injured. When they came back, they expected something. And the problem was, if you look at early photographs, you will see encampments of returned servicemen and women living in tents on the grounds of the Melbourne MCG, right? On the ground in the Botanic Gardens. They came back living in tents, and they expected much, much more. So then you saw the introduction of the Commonwealth Veterans Affairs, because many of them are injured. Particular hospitals were set up. Those of you who are old enough may remember the Veterans Hospitals, like in Victoria, the hospital in Heidelberg, next to the Austin Hospital, a repatriation hospital. They provided permanent accommodation as well as services for injured returned servicemen and women. At the same time, in order to overcome the housing shortage, we saw the beginning of public housing, a significant public housing movement, and it came from that shortage and that push from returned servicemen and women for something in return for their sacrifices. And we see what was called the Federal War Homes Grant, where many returned servicemen and women who didn't have a house were actually allocated a war services home, which was built rapidly and which they paid off over a number of decades at an exceptionally low rates. Now, by the end of the 1940s, the pressure from people, especially with the Labor government that had been in power pre-war and post-war, there was exceptional pressure for the federal government to take on an increasing responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. But unfortunately, under the Constitution, they didn't have the power, they didn't have the income tax power, or even the power to set up a viable social security system, except for returned servicemen and women. So guess what? In 1949, the most significant referendum result that's ever occurred in this country occurred when the Australian people voted for the federal government to take over income tax and to provide social security benefits for its people. So the extension of the social security benefits scheme began after the successful passage of that referendum. And those of you interested in referendums, I think it's about 97 referendums, could be 93, only 11 have passed. So, at the same time, we had a growing militant working class movement in this country, which was to a significant degree highly unionised because of all those struggles that occurred in the late 19th century, the shearers' strike, the failed shearers' strike, the failed maritime strike, the failed coal strikes after World War II, when the Labor government sent in troops to break up the strike. So what we saw is people demanded more than a social security net. They demanded to have access to essential services. And this is when we saw state governments and the federal government begin the expansion and the creation of the public sector. Public housing, public health to a lesser degree, public energy production, things like telecommunications, anything that was essential. The Commonwealth Bank was expanded, the role of the post office was expanded, and so what we saw is some real competition in the Australian economy. You had competition between the public sector, you had a public airline Qantas, you had the Commonwealth Bank, you had CSL, you had various state governments owning energy production facilities. You had increasing public housing. At one stage in Victoria, 15% of Victorians lived in public housing by the mid-1960s. So you've got all these public institutions being created to, in many regards, satisfy demands. And that's the key word, demands, from a militant Australian workforce. And that militancy, to a major degree, was not just a historical accident. It occurred because people understood that by becoming united and withdrawing their labour, they could actually push governments into making legislation to not only just provide a social security net, but provide public institutions. So I'm old enough to remember that when you flew, you never flew with Ansett, you flew with Qantas. It was a publicly owned company. A transport accident, yeah, TAA, yeah. You flew with them. You didn't fly, so that you went to the Commonwealth Bank to deposit your money and get your loans because it was publicly owned. You didn't even think about where you would buy your electricity or gas from because obviously there was only one monopoly and that was owned by the government of the day. Now, what people don't seem to understand, and I'll talk about demutualisation, privatisation in a minute, is that in a capitalist society, one based on private investment for private profit, you need competition. When there is no competition, prices increase and profits increase for shareholders and owners. Right? Because that's the way the system works. But the trouble is the end point of a capitalist system is the creation of monopolies and duopolies and corporate entities, right? And that's the end point. Now, individual small business cannot compete against a corporation or duopoly or monopoly. We see that every day. So what we saw was the real competition existing between the public sector and the private sector. If you had a strong public housing sector, which was owned and managed by the government of the day, whether it was the state or federal level, they were able to put downward pressure on prices in the private sector, because not everybody needed to go to the private sector. When you've got a Commonwealth Bank, that puts downward pressure on the private banks, on what they can charge, because they've got to compete with the government of the day, because that's what they're competing with. I used to call it unfair competition. Right? Unfair competition, because they've got to compete with the government of the day. People didn't seem to understand that. At the same time, most, not all, but most publicly owned assets made a profit. And that profit could be used to expand the business of the publicly owned sector, or to send a profit back to the Treasury to be used to support, social security system, defence, whatever. Right? So I'm making a profit. Now, some capitalist societies have a third tier to the economy, which we've only had a very small amount in this country, and that's the cooperative and collectivist sector. And especially in countries where there is no social security benefits, as in many developing nations today, or third world countries, whatever you like to call them, there is a growth in the cooperative and collective sector that actually can provide meaningful employment and income for large numbers of people. So you've got this three-tier system. I looked at Peru at one stage, and you had public entities, private entities, and a strong cooperative collective sector. The cooperative and collective sector was mainly for people who were on the margins. The public sector was basically bureaucrats. So here, by the end of the 1970s, you've still got a strong trade union movement. You haven't got legislation which removes the right of Australian workers to withdraw their labour. I mean, we're no different to China, although we like to think we're different there. You can't picket, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so what happened was, there was a pushback. You call it a counter-revolution, you call it whatever you like. There was a push back from the private sector that something should be done to allow them to grow and increase their profitability. And that sector, those ideas which really originated in the 1960s and developed in the 1970s, were the idea of privatisation. And what we were told, and what we believe, let's not forget this, these are things that, we believed in. As a people, I'm not saying you four did, but is that private always does it better. Private is always, the better way to go. Whether it's private health, private energy, private telecommunications. And the population believed. So the first foray against the mutual aid, which is the mutual provident societies, and the publicly owned companies, was what's described as the demutualisation of all these mutual societies. For example, the Australian AMP was a mutual society. And so what happened is, they said to people who didn't even realise they were members, they said, we'll give you $600 if you give us your voting rights. And they bought them out. And most of the mutual societies by the middle of the 1980s had disappeared and had been absorbed into the private sector. This gave the impetus for the privatisation debate to be taken up by the Australian Labor Party, which had been responsible for the creation of all those public institutions which provided essential services to the community at the state or federal level. The ideology changed back to what I would describe as an 18th century state. The 18th century state was based on the concept that the state was there to protect the interests of those who exercised power and accumulated wealth. The armed forces were there to maintain their integrity and their property. So what happened during the era of, as I said before, revolutions, the 19th century is that the philosophy changed, that the state was not only there to maintain order, but it was there to provide for its citizens. And these, this disgusting wars, which caused so many casualties and so much pain and suffering, were the impetus that forced people to become more militant and forced the state to take on their responsibilities. Let's not forget, going back to Social Security, that it wasn't until the Whitlam Labor government was elected in 1972 that pensions were introduced for single mothers. That 72 was in our lifetime, except for Paul's most likely. But it was in our lifetime.
It's in his lifetime.
It's in his lifetime.
But he wouldn't remember. No, I wouldn't remember.
No, you have these ridiculous situations. So, the 1980s, the 1990s became what I call the decades of the triumph of propaganda. And the propaganda was that if you privatise everything, prices will drop. It'll be more efficient. You'll get better services. And so what we've seen is an orgy of privatisation. And my apologies to people involved in orgies. It's an orgy of privatisation. We've seen the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank. Commonwealth Bank shares, I think, were sold for about $2.80. On today's market price, one Commonwealth Bank share costs $280. Think about it. Medibank Private was privatised. Well, that was government owned. The railways were privatised, not in terms of the rolling stock was sold off. These were the Labor governments were doing this. The Commonwealth Serum Laboratory was privatised by Mr Keating for $2.60. You'd be lucky to get a share for over $300 today, one share. You've got the privatisation of all the energy, and obviously all you now nice people that use gas and electricity still, that have got your solar panels, would have benefited greatly from the privatisation and increased competition. I'm sure your prices have dropped dramatically.
Hugely.
Hugely.
We're much better off.
Much better off. And the coup de grace is the privatisation of the country's airports.
Yeah.
The privatisation of the country's ports. Our good friend, the former Premier, whose name shall not pass my lips, privatised, this is the Victorian Premier, Mr Andrews, privatised the Port of Melbourne. You know? They privatised the Titles Office. They're talking about privatising the Transport Accident Commission. They privatised public transport. And the list goes on and on and on. And in every single regard, things have gone backwards. Why have they gone backwards? Because we live in a capitalist society. We need competition to decrease prices, put a lid on prices, and if everything is in the hands of the private sector in a particular field of endeavour or the economy, there is no downward pressure on prices. Therefore, when you get your bank charges, you get charges on charges on charges for things they don't do, they just make up. You just look at a statement. I look at a lot of bank statements in my business, and I can tell you, you get charges for a charge for a charge. Now, if there was a strong Commonwealth Bank, that wouldn't occur. But I said the disaster was public housing. Public housing has been a responsibility of state governments around the country, and every state government, except Queensland initially, have privatised their public housing. And we're told constantly, public housing is bad. Public health is bad. Why is it bad?
Costs money too.
Yeah, why is it bad? Because, believe it or not, there is no revenue because the limited taxation revenue that comes into this country to properly fund public education, public housing. So there's this vortex, you've got these private entities sucking in wealth. Wealth is not actually providing wealth to the state, and the state not actually being able to provide services to the population at large. And the fact there's a terrible mental health system, a terrible public health system, a terrible public transport system, everybody says it's because it's publicly owned. Not because it's been starved of funds, because of the inadequate taxation revenues. So you get this thing, and the public housing struggle, those of us who have been involved in that for a decade or two. The thing is, it's a little bit like people calling me an anarchist. You know, they think, oh, that's a terrible thing. You know, he's into destruction. You know, it's the same with the public sector. Anything public is bad. Anything private is good. We privatise the job-seeking agencies. We've privatised homelessness. We've privatised the National Disability Insurance Scheme where the costs have blown out because the private sector is the only sector. We privatised the aged care sector. Could you imagine that? The aged care sector. We've privatised early childhood development. And these have been specific government policies that have been legislated for, not based on what happens to the population at large, whether it's a good service or not, but because it will generate increasing profits for the private sector. For example, when Howard privatised the aged care sector, the private companies refused to take up the offer. They said the only way we will take up that offer, because we can't make a profit, is that if you remove the ratio between staff and residents. So instead of having one nurse for 10 staff, you have one nurse for 100 staff. And that increased their profitability and they moved into the aged care sector. Now, what happens, and this is a fascinating thing, when there is no competition, as we spoke about at the beginning, you create these private entities, and initially you've got all these small businesses which jump into the private entity. But within a decade, these private entities have been reduced to a few large corporations. Look at the companies that run unemployment. Salvation Army, Serena Russo, it's just a handful of companies. It's the same with the aged care sector. A handful of corporations, some are owned by equity funds from overseas. Look at telecommunications, and the list goes on and on. So, ultimately, we allow this to happen. Maybe not us individually, but as a community, we have allowed this to happen because we have believed the propaganda that public is bad, private is good. For example, go back to the public housing sector. You say to somebody, oh, I live in public housing, they think, my God, you poor little thing. How can you cope? You know? How can you cope? It's so terrible. Now, public housing doesn't have to be terrible. In the 1980s and 1990s in Victoria, the government, understanding that putting people with significant issues together in the same block caused problems, we're hell-bent on what we call a spot purchasing program. What that means is that they spot purchase properties around the state in communities, and public tenants would then be put into these properties. In the majority of cases, and I have a number of patients still in public housing spot purchase properties, meant that these people had security. The key about housing is having secure tenure. And it doesn't mean you've got to buy a property to have secure tenure. If it's government owned and government managed, you get secure tenure. And I've seen people over 30 to 40 years, when I'm that old, have children, grow their families have interacted with the local community, they've gone to the same sporting clubs, the same religious organisations, they've got on in their lives, in their different ways, and nobody looks at them and say, that's a public house over there, number 62, Mirralbark Road, Mirralbark. Nobody knows. Simple, they're members of the community. So there are mechanisms by which we can actually promote the positive aspect of public assets, not just in terms of competition, but in terms of the security it provides for people. If you have to deal with a private entity, all you can do is complain to the government regulator that has been set up to deal with complaints, whether it's housing, whether it's energy, whether it's medicine, you name it, there's a public entity that's been set up. The problem is the legislation under which it's set up is grossly limited So your ability to actually bring them to account is grossly limited. And more importantly, you find they don't actually have the staff, the revenue to hire the staff to ensure the law is applied to these private organisations. If an entity is owned by the public, you can, through the electoral process, the fact you have elections every 3 to 4 years, depending on the president of the state, means you can apply direct pressure as a consumer on your local political representative. Now, if you've got an issue with an energy company today and you go to your local rep, they'll say to you, well, go to the regulator. That's why we set up the regulator. And the regulator will say after about 6 months, oh, I can't really resolve this. I haven't got the legislative agenda, or you're outside my legislative framework, or I don't have the staff to pursue this thing. So there are many, many positive aspects to public ownership. And the dilemma is, interestingly, we are seeing people's views, not individually, but as a nation, changing back to the idea of having public entities. You've got the Victorian state government under pressure under Andrews, talked about setting up a state-owned energy system. They had no intention of doing it. They set up a department, and that's the end of that. The current election, which has been held in Tasmania, is not just about the stadium, it's about the fact the Liberal-led government was going to privatise significant public assets in Tasmania. Tasmania is a small state with 500,000 people. It relies heavily on forestry, which is publicly owned, and it relies on other publicly owned industries for many people in that category to be employed. And the fact they were talking about privatising what's left of the public sector caused a real ruckus. So things are moving. But the trouble is, it's not about, and this is where we get a little bit radical, it's not about recreating the wheel. It's about legislating to remove control of these privately owned assets from their shareholders. The infrastructure is there. We can take it back. And if people say under the Constitution you've got to compensate people for loss of property, you get around it by forcing them to go into a 40-year lease, or increasing taxation to such a degree they throw up their hands in horror and leave the power station to you to run. Now the other interesting thing is new developments. Let's look at, and this will be the last thing, renewable energy. Everybody's talking about carbon neutral by 2050. The world's going to come to an end, blah, 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 blah. I believe all that. The only good thing about being old, I won't be here to see the end of the world. I'll just leave it to my grandchildren to die miserable deaths. But the important thing is, when you own an asset, like an energy producing asset, and it's owned by the government of the day, the government of the day can put in legislation in place to close down those assets and provide for the people who are going to lose their livelihoods if those assets are being closed down. But in the private sector, when it's in the hands of the private sector, and you talk about closing down those assets, you get resistance from workers because their livelihood is dependent on employment in that private sector. So as a public, we have no power. The other thing you've got to remember is when you talk about renewable energy, where's all the money going? Is it going to set up publicly owned solar farms? Is it going to set up publicly owned windmills? Is it to set up publicly owned transmission lines? The government is giving, on our behalf, billions of dollars to the private energy renewable sector, to the private sector, to create centralised renewable energy. Not decentralised, but centralised renewable energy. So all that's happening is the corporations move from providing electricity from coal and gas to providing electricity from renewable sources, but they still own the assets. In the story. And obviously I don't want to talk about, maybe I'll talk about nationalising mineral resources another day. But what I'm just saying is, this is nothing that, what's happened is something that we allowed to happen because as a people, I'm not talking about individual blame, but as a people, we accepted the propaganda and the ideology that public is bad, private is good, and those situations where public is bad, it's bad because there's been no revenue allocated to the public sector to provide reasonable services for people. Any questions?
So, the why is that, we, like, because the question to me is why did so many people fall for it? I didn't. But why did so many people fall for it?
Very good, because all the major political parties took on the ideology. You had no difference of policy regarding privatisation. It was really the Hawke-Keating government that set the ball rolling, big time.
They should be stronger.
Well, yeah, well,
I mean, like they brought in the Accord,
that's right.
which shackled workers from taking any action.
Yeah.
I mean, militancy of the trade unions has disappeared. They're basically just treading water in order to survive. I understand why, because they can't even say boo. But it was taken up big time by Hawke-Keating government. And we all believed it because it was going to be good for the country, good for the economy.
I think also people didn't want to keep fighting.
No.
I don't think so.
I think people just accept that this is going to be a good thing.
And we got distracted, like people got distracted by, you had to have your own lawnmower and washing machine, all that sort of material stuff. I think people got distracted.
I think we got distracted by Mammon.
We got distracted.
By Mammon.
Oh, man.
Yes.
Okay.
We all thought we were going to become rich. Seriously, we all thought it was going to help us and help our children.
Well, you and I are rich.
Oh yeah, loads of
Yeah. I'll tell you a little story about competition in the real estate sector. In 1982, my late wife and myself, with the help of a bank, we bought a little house in Richmond. 3-bedroom house, slanted on a little Richmond block. It was sitting on the ground, not even stumps, for the woeful sum of $42,500. Right? That same property, we sold it 4 years later for double the price. But that same property in 2017, no renovation, still not on stumps, sold for $1.6 million. So it went up 40 times. And that is the story. As those people that go into the housing market, as their asset increased in value, they became enamored with this concept that somehow that privatising things is going to help them in the long run, because the money was coming in, because there was no competition in the real estate sector between private and public. Now, wages went up 7-fold in that period, housing prices went up 40-fold. And so we were kind of lulled into this false sense of security. People forgot that if you only had one home and you had to buy another one, it didn't matter if your property was $5 million or $50, you're going to have to buy another one for a similar price in the marketplace. But having those big sums in front of you made you think things were really good. And today you've got older people, sell their homes, downsize, sell it for $1 million, buy some little villa in a little unit, save themselves 500 grand, and they think they've done really well. And they have, financial. But they forget they've got to pay for their aged care because it's not subsidised for most people. You've got to pay for a lot of your health care, you've got to pay for your dental care, you've got to pay increased electricity costs, gas costs, petrol costs, transport costs, and all this. So when you add it all up, it's not, you really haven't profited. We've lost.
Okay, so now we're in a situation where we've got young people who are saying, unless they've got rich parents like Dutton's son, sadly he didn't really think he had enough money to buy. But is what pressure are those people going to put on? It's the security of tenure, which I really understand, and so people are not going to, like, at the moment the young people are living in the private rental market, because they're young and whatever, they can maybe put up with this being shifted every couple of years. What, are they going to be taking action to
Well, it depends.
address the balance,
The problem is this. There's many ways you can put chains on people. You don't have to do like the good old convict days when the convicts first came.
Yeah.
You don't have to put chains and balls on their legs. You put financial chains on them. You start them off for HEX debt. Then you load them with a huge mortgage, minimum of 500,000.
If they can get it.
If they can get it. And that means they're financially wrapped up in tape. If they get a little bit militant, they lose their job because of computerisation. Everybody knows everything. You get easily blacklisted. It's very hard to get another job. You lose your home. So there's all these pressures. So unless they actually come together, and again, this is difficult, come together as a group, things won't change. And I don't see any coming together as a group. I see a lot of what I call WWWRSI, like, but I don't see much action. I mean, you may get action regarding the atrocities in Gaza. You may get action, as we saw today, regarding the Yorick Justice Commission. You'll get a few thousand people turn up. But you look at the public housing struggle, minimal support. Because, I belong to a little group called Public Housing Everybody's Business. Because public housing isn't just about the people who require public housing. It's all our responsibility, because a strong housing sector helps me, it helps my children, because it decreases housing prices.
It also helps the economy, I would have thought, because you've got less issues. People
So, but I think we've reached the crescendo of privatisation. Unfortunately, there's little left to privatise. They're even talking about privatising the HEX debt.
Yeah.
Oh yes, you name it, we can privatise it. You name it. I mean, most of the public hospital sector, people don't understand. The public hospital sector in Victoria, a significant amount has been privatised.
Yeah.
Like all the ward staff and cleaning staff are actually outsourced workers from a private corporation. They're not employed by the government. Many of the pathology laboratories, X-ray facilities are privately owned in the public sector. So what we're seeing is governments washing their hands of their responsibility to their citizens, because their citizens are happy to acquiesce and cast a ballot every 3 years and forget about what happens in the interim. And that's why we never seem to solve any problems in this country. Well, we are in many regards, because some countries, everything is owned by the state. Other countries, we've got mixed economies. I mean, look at the Norwegians. They get 90% of the revenue from their resources, and the private companies, which they've outsourced the development of those resources, are still making healthy profits. Here we get maybe 3% back, and the private companies get 97% back. I mean, that's privatisation in reverse. What we've privatised is our own, well, it's not ours, but the country's resources, our mineral resources. So I'm not talking about, as I said, reinventing the wheel. I'm talking about the state through legislation, which comes through resistance, passing legislation to take back ownership. For example, Iraq. Remember the coalition of the willing?
Mm-hmm.
What's the first thing that happened when the Iraq government fell? The Saddam Hussein regime fell. I mean, they privatised the petroleum sector. What happened when the Iraqis took back control of the government? They nationalised the petroleum sector. In Iraq today, over 45% of people are public employees of the petroleum sector. So it can be done. It can be done. You can reverse it. Anything that's human can be reversed. We've seen the Palestinians in Gaza reduced to beyond the Stone Age. You know, anything is possible if there is the push. But again, in this country, there isn't a push. We do have a lot of diversions. It's not like 50 years ago. There's a lot of diversions. There's Tinder, there's computer games, there's gaming, there's festivals, there's music, you name it, we've got it. It's all there.
So you're saying computer games are opening up the masses?
No, I'm saying they're opium is the opium of the masses. No, I'm just saying we have many diversions in our society, many ways to distract people, many circuses, many ways to distract people. And a lot of people become distracted, because you did mention this before, is their time. Their time to fighting back. Because what's the point of fighting a balloon? Every time you punch the balloon, you take your fist out, it re-expands. That's what happens when you complain to a private regulator. I've known people who've been, cross purposes with Telstra for 10 years. They eventually settle for a $10,000, which is nothing, compensation, because they'd gone to the end of the process and they almost lost their sanity.
Yeah.
And we all know people like that. We see them every day. So I'm not cynical. I believe change is possible.
But I think that's the next question, isn't it? You've painted quite a dire situation.
No, we are in a dire situation.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
And but so what are we going to do about it? I mean,
What can you and I do? All we can do is talk about it.
we can party.
We can party, yeah, we can talk about it. We can actually. Why do you think the Liberal Labor government was such a reformist government? Because there was a militant people pushing them to introduce all these reforms, which have been bottlenecked for over a quarter of a century. And we don't have that. Now, we may be a telephone box minority. Those of you who remember what a telephone box is. But the fact is that it's ideas that nourish and create political, social, environmental, cultural movements. So we have that responsibility to continue to blow on those embers. And my advice to all those people who call themselves left or right or centre, using all these old terminologies, to look at things in terms of power and wealth. Will that decision increase somebody's power, or will it decrease somebody's power? Will that decision increase the wealth of a shrinking minority, or will it decrease? And in that way, you don't get involved in these huge sectarian battles about nothing in particular, because you're getting nowhere as a political and social movement. Now, it's all very well to be involved in the protests regarding the atrocities which occur in Gaza, but ultimately that's not the only thing which is an atrocity. I mean, it's an atrocity to me that in a population of 27 million, that we have 3 million people that have got food insecurity. Nice word, they go hungry. That we have children going to public schools, private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. Now, I stood as a candidate in Flinders, and I came 7th out of 7, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I picked up around 1,000 votes, all right, 1%. And my opening gambit to people was, And it's true. I had tears in my eyes when I first saw that advertisement for this private charity, which I'm sure is a wonderful thing, raising money to send Aussie kids to public schools. Could you imagine that 30 years ago in Australia? Could you imagine that? What happens there is then all that money that needs to go to Medicine Sans Frontiers or World Vision or other things that look after kids that are really have no options outside Australia dries up.
Yeah.
You know? And what do I pay taxes for?
Yeah.
When somebody tells me, oh, you've got to wait 2 years to see an orthopaedic surgeon in the public system as a doctor, they tell me that, I say, well, what do I pay taxes for?
Yeah.
You know? Or I've got somebody who needs an operation, who's got to wait 12 months, but if I knew they had private insurance, a bit of cash, I could get it organised next week.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, that makes you cry.
Yeah.
But it's not my fault, and it's not your fault. It's the community's fault because we accepted the propaganda. Thank you.